Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. With Thanksgiving just around the corner, many of us are already dreaming of turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie. But have you ever stopped to wonder what the very first Thanksgiving was actually like? The picture we have in our heads, often from elementary school plays, is probably a bit different from the historical reality. So today, we're going to travel back in time to 1621 and uncover the true story of the first Thanksgiving. It's a story of survival, unexpected alliances, and a 3-day feast that looked nothing like our modern holiday. So grab a snack, maybe not a turkey leg just yet, and let's dive into the fascinating history. Let's set the scene. The year is 1621, and the place is Plymouth, Mass. The Pilgrims, who had sailed from England on the Mayflower, had just endured an absolutely brutal first year in the New World. They arrived too late in 1622 plant crops, and the winter that followed was devastating. They faced starvation, widespread sickness, and the harsh, unfamiliar environment. Out of the 102 passengers who arrived, only about half survived that first winter. It was a time of immense hardship and loss. So, when the autumn of 1621 rolled around and they managed to bring in a successful harvest, it was a massive relief. They had finally managed to grow enough food to hopefully see them through the next winter. This successful harvest is the core reason for the celebration we now call the first Thanksgiving. It was a moment to give thanks for their survival and for the bounty of the land. Now, who was at this famous feast? It wasn't just the 50 or so surviving pilgrims. They were joined by about 90 men from the Wampanoag tribe, led by their chief, Masisa. This wasn't just a friendly dinner party invitation. The relationship between the pilgrims and the Wampanoag was complex and crucial for the colonists' survival. The Wampanoag had been living on that land for thousands of years. They knew the seasons, the soil, and the wildlife. One Wampanoag, man in particular, named Tisquanem, or Squantoaz, is more famously known, played a vital role. Squanto had a remarkable and tragic backstory. He had been captured by English explorers years earlier, taken to Europe, and learned English. When he finally made his way back to his homeland, he found that his entire village had been wiped out by disease. He became an indispensable interpreter and guide for the pilgrims, teaching them how to plant native crops like corn, how to tap maple trees for sap, and where to fish and hunt. Without the help and knowledge shared by the Wampanoag, it's highly unlikely the Plymouth colony would have survived. The feast was a moment that symbolized this fragile but necessary alliance. So what do they eat? Forget the centerpiece turkey, the buttery mashed potatoes, and the sweet cranberry sauce. The menu in 1621 was very different. While they did eat wildfowl, which could have included turkey, it wasn't the star of the show. Historical accounts from the time, like the writings of colonist Edward Winslow, mention that the Wampanoag guests arrived and went on a hunt, bringing back 5 deer. So, venison was a major part of the meal. The feast was a true reflection of the local environment. They ate a lot of seafood, which was abundant. This would have included lobster, clams, mussels, and fish like bass and cod. They also ate vegetables they had successfully grown, thanks to the Wampanoag's guidance. This meant corn, which they would have eaten as a cornmeal porridge or bread, along with beans and various kinds of squash. They also foraged for wild nuts, like chestnuts and walnuts, and local fruits and berries. It was a true farm-to-table and forest-to-table experience. Now, for what they didn't eat. Let's bust a few myths. First, there was no pumpkin pie. While they had pumpkins and other squashes, they had no butter or wheat flour to make a pie crust. More importantly, their sugar supply from the Mayflower had been long depleted. Without sugar, most of the desserts we associate with Thanksgiving were impossible. No pies, no cakes, no sweet treats. Also, potatoes weren't on the menu. Both sweet potatoes and white potatoes weren't common in that part of North America at the time. And that jellied cranberry sauce? Definitely not. While they had cranberries, they had no sugar to sweeten them. So they would have been used for color or perhaps in a savory dish, but not as the sweet relish we know today. And another thing, they didn't have ovens for baking, so any bread would have been a denser type cooked over a fire. And finally, they didn't have forks. They would have eaten with spoons, knives, and their hands. Another big difference from our modern holiday was the duration. This was an a one-day affair, where you eat a big meal and then fall asleep on the couch. The first Thanksgiving was a 3-day harvest festival. It was a prolonged period of feasting, diplomacy, and entertainment. The Pilgrims and Wampanoag shared meals, but they also engaged in other activities. Accounts mention that they ran races, played games, and demonstrated their skills. The Pilgrims showed off their military drills with their muskets, and the Wampanoag demonstrated their skill with a bow and arrow. It was a cultural exchange, a chance for these two very different groups to interact in a moment of peace and mutual need. It was less of a formal, solemn religious holiday and more of a lively, secular harvest celebration, a community gathering to celebrate a successful year and fortify alliances. So, if this happened in 1621, when did it become the national holiday we celebrate today? For a long, long time, it wasn't one. Throughout the colonial period and early American history, days of Thanksgiving were proclaimed sporadically by individual colonies or states, usually to celebrate a military victory or the end of a drought. It wasn't a unified annual event. The idea of making Thanksgiving a national holiday was championed for years by a magazine editor named Sarah Josepha Halley. You might know her as the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb. She wrote letters to presidents for decades, arguing that a national day of thanks could help unite the country. Finally, in 1863, in the midst of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln declared the last Thursday in November as a national day of Thanksgiving. He hoped it would be a day to give thanks and to help heal the wounds of a deeply divided nation. So, the holiday as we know it, a fixed, annual, national event, is really a product of the 19th century, not the 17th. When we look back at the first Thanksgiving, it's important to see it clearly, with all its complexities. It was not the beginning of a simple, happy story of two cultures living in perfect harmony. The relationship between the European settlers and Native Americans would become fraught with conflict, broken promises, and immense tragedy in the years that followed. For many Native Americans today, Thanksgiving is a day of mourning, a reminder of the loss of their lands, their people, and their way of life. Recognizing this painful history is just as important as understanding the details of the 1621 feast. The original event was a temporary moment of cooperation born out of necessity. The Pilgrims were grateful for their survival and for the help they received. The Wampanoag, led by Massasoit, saw an alliance with the colonists as strategically beneficial against their rival tribes. The feast symbolized a moment of mutual dependence and hope for the future, a future that, unfortunately, would unfold in ways that were devastating for the native peoples of America. So, as you gather with your friends and family this year, maybe you can share some of these stories. The story of a 3-day harvest festival, of venison and seafood instead of just turkey, of a time before pumpkin pie. But most importantly, the story of two very different cultures coming together in a fragile moment of cooperation. The first Thanksgiving was fundamentally about gratitude for survival against overwhelming odds, and acknowledging the interdependence between people. And perhaps that is the most timeless and important lesson we can take from that distant autumn feast in 1621. It reminds us to be thankful for the food on our tables, for the people in our lives, and for the simple fact of survival and community. Thanks so much for watching and for taking this historical journey with me today. I hope it gave you a new perspective on a familiar holiday. What part of the story did you find most surprising? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video and learned something new, please give it a thumbs up. And consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Have a wonderful and meaningful Thanksgiving. See you in the next video.